I'm Jan Turnquist. I'm the Executive Director here at Orchard House. It is a great pleasure to have this event for our outgoing Chair of the Select Board, Matt Johnson. I'm just so pleased that we can do this here. This is the kind of thing that I think if the Olcotts were alive today, they would be so happy to have you all here. I definitely think that. So just a quick word about this building. Most of you know the Olcott family lived here. Louise May Alcott wrote and set Little Women in the house there. The house actually dates from the mid-1600s. There's a wonderful history pre-Olcott, which we can talk about some other time. In 1879, Bronson Olcott started one of the very first adult education programs in the country in the study of Orchard House. And it was so well subscribed immediately that people had to stand outside the study with windows wide open so they could listen from outside. One of the attendees, a woman from New York, Elizabeth Thompson, donated some of her inheritance, $1,000, 512 of which were spent to build this lecture hall. Bronson Olcott wanted it to look like nature, to go up in an aspiring fashion, the way transcendentalist thinkers, of course, thought should happen. And so the Concord School of Philosophy and Literature was built, and by 1880, the very next year, all the sessions were held here. So you are sitting in the place where Ralph Waldo Emerson stood and spoke. Henry Thoreau's papers were read here posthumously. Many people whose names you would know, some you would not, but Julie Ward Howe, for example, was a frequent speaker. I know her husband must have accompanied her many times, and recently I've been talking with Perkins because her husband, I'm trying to remember his first name, but I'll just call him
Samuel Ward Howe?
Samuel Gridley, it was Gridley, Samuel Gridley Howe. I knew that was close, Samuel Gridley Howe. He was the director of the Perkins School for the Blind. Louise's uncle was a frequent contributor. He was on the board there. He was the chairman of the board there. Louisa herself donated to the Perkins School. So there's quite a wonderful connection there. So Julia Ward Howe was a frequent speaker. I love the story. It might be slightly apocryphal that she was asked to sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic after she spoke, because of course she wrote that. But there's a long history to this place. I'm just so happy to have it here. And Matt, with that short introduction, I want to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. And this party is just the culmination of a fantasy for me. So first of all, how did all this happen? I was on the select board. Margot thought, oh, it'd be fun to have a party, and she was going to have a secret party where she was going to invite. I mentioned to her my regret that I had been taking Victor Curran's History of Concord class when I was running, right before I started running for the select board, and then when I ran for the select board, and then COVID hit. And so between the campaign and COVID, I couldn't finish the class. I attended all but the last session, and worse than that, I couldn't do the final exam where you give a little tour. And that, to me, it's like, those of you who don't know me, the idea that I would not pass a class, just unbearable. So for 3 years, this has just been bugging me. I finally get off of the select board, and now it's time. Okay, so this event suddenly just came together, and I was like, oh, I got to do it. So I have created this virtual tour about the most detested character of the 18th century in Concord. I mean, there's not even close. It's not even close. So I've got the handouts for folks because, you know, it's a little hard to see, and some of the things are wordy, but worth kind of reading aloud. And I got to say, one copy for myself. And I don't know if I have enough for everybody, but we're close. So why would you want to do a tour about the most detested character of the 18th century in Concord? Well, it turns out that this guy, Dr. Joseph Lee, was kind of the antagonist for many significant events in that century. And so while, of course, normally it's the victors that write history, even Victor Curran, but that it's sometimes, the losers happen to write things down, because ultimately it's people who write things down that write history. So, and he did have a diary with many significant entries over the years that I think have helped corroborate different stories in the town. So I became fascinated with this character when I read Bob Gross's book, the classic, The Minutemen and Their World. If you have not read this book, you absolutely must. It's just, especially if you're in Concord. But on top of that, it's also a classic in history and its methodology and in its readability. So it's enjoyable. It's very contemporary, especially the new expanded and revised edition is absolutely on point today. And you just learn so much. But so this character, Joseph Lee, it turns out, if you've heard of the Concord Lyceum, which was a lecture series that was given, in a lot of the 18th or 19th century, the last time that there was a sort of full treatment of Joseph Lee was in the Concord Lyceum 140 years ago, so 1883. And so I kind of went down the rabbit hole with this guy, and he almost became for me, like if you've ever heard the play Wicked, he is sort of the Wicked Witch of the West for Concord, but he's, but he's a historic figure. So I even wrote to Gregory Maguire, and I said, the 250th is coming up. Wouldn't it be great to do a story about this guy? It'd be like Wicked, but it would be like, and he wrote me back and he said, I could never write historic fiction. It always sounds stilted. The dialogue is terrible. You write it. So, he said, you sound inspired. Why don't you just write it? So I said, well, I'm on the select board. I mean, what am I going to do? Anyway, so let's get into it. What is this story about? Well, the tour takes you through a lot of familiar places in Concord that you would get in a lot of Concord tours, and then out a little bit further out because that's where the guy lived, and a couple of critical scenes happen out there. But we won't have to walk around. We're just going to sit here and go through it. So first thing is, Joseph Lee was much better known 140 years ago in town as a character than he is now. And indeed, if you've ever heard of Neshawtuck Hill, the fancy neighborhood near town, it used to be called Lee's Hill. And they even imagined, so one of the Reverend Grindle Reynolds, who was at First Parish, gave that Concord Lyceum talk in 1883. He concluded by saying, oh, well, his impression is permanent. Lee's Hill will outlive all the names, and, no, it's gone. But he also summed up his character saying, that he was selfish, that set opinions, not pugnacious, not a nice guy, okay? So, yes?
I think you might explain to people that they...
Yeah, and your handout goes through this stuff because, again, there are places where there's a lot of words. And they always tell you in PowerPoint, don't put a lot of words, but I couldn't help myself.
So we're on slide page 4.
So who was this Dr. Joseph Lee? So first of all, he was a rich guy. He owned a lot of land. His grandfather had come from Ipswich, Mass. To Concord and settled in this farm. And it was 375 acres. It encompassed Egg Rock, all of the area, the river around the side here, and all of what we now consider Elm Street, north. And so that was a nice holding, but it actually wasn't the limit. The thing with Dr. Joseph Lee was he wasn't a real doctor. Okay, so, he was technically a physician, but there is no record that I could find of him actually attending university. He probably apprenticed from his father, who was also a physician, and he wanted the honorific of doctor, but he didn't actually practice medicine much, So, and probably just as well, exactly. I don't know if you want this guy to be cutting you up. What he was fundamentally was a capitalist. Okay, so back in those days, there weren't commercial banks. Okay, so if you fell on hard times, you needed to mortgage your property, you go find the guy who has some free cash, and on terms that he sets, you borrow. And so he made a good living off of that, and also off of land trade elsewhere, and so became a prominent, and wealthy citizen. So, and you can see that was Thoreau did the survey of the land after Lee's death, but you can see here sort of the modern view of what there is now. So, our story begins in Haywood Meadow. Now, this is the only speculative location on this tour because actually there is no record where this event occurred, just simply that it occurred. So in the 1830s, the minister, and we'll do ecclesiastical history here, which I know sounds really obscure, but for the first 200 years of Concord, ecclesiastical history and history were intertwined, inevitably. The minister was on the town payroll. He was the most highly paid person. Everybody had to go to church. It was essential to have and the eras of Concord pretty much could be defined by who was minister for the first 6 or 7 ministers in Concord history, roughly. But anyway, this guy Whiting, who was the minister until the 1830s, he had a problem with drinking. And so he eventually didn't show up one morning on Sunday, and of course the whole town's there, and so anyway, he was dismissed. And so they went out and they found a new guy, and his name was Daniel Bliss. And Daniel Bliss was of this group of ministers, this new movement at that time in religion called the Great Awakening, or otherwise known as the New Lights, okay? And the New Lights were preachers that you would kind of recognize today. If you think of Pentecostalist, evangelical types of ministers, all of a sudden, this was a wave going through. And one of the leaders of the wave, not the initiator, but one of the biggest proponents of this style of preaching was this guy, George Whitefield. It's spelled Whitefield, but pronounced Whitefield. And this guy was an itinerant preacher. He would go around. He didn't have his own parish. He grew up poor. He actually had to be a servant to another student when he went to school. And anyway, afterwards, they didn't give him a parish, but he didn't let that stop him. He went everywhere. He gave, I think, 18,000 sermons around North America and the UK. And it's estimated like millions of people saw his sermons. And the thing about Whitefield was he was a slight-statured guy, and yet his voice was so powerful that he could give outdoor sermons to 10,000 and more people at a time. Okay, so you hear this and you think, is that really true? 10,000 people? Well, we're not the only people that might have doubted that. In fact, Ben Franklin, when Whitefield came to Philadelphia, went out and paced away from Whitefield as he was speaking until he couldn't hear him clearly. When he got to that horizon, he then made a calculation of how many people would fit in the ark. And he ended up agreeing that over 10,000 people would fit into that space. Okay, so it is credible. Certainly, Franklin was one of the most prominent scientists of his era. And actually, Franklin and Whitefield became fast friends, even though theologically they differed on many things. And so when Whitefield comes to Concord, it's like, you've got the Beatles coming to Concord. I mean, and indeed, he says thousands. The population of Concord was less than that in the time. So it's as if more than the whole town is gathered. Probably the people in the crowd had never experienced a crowd that big, And so there was a lot of excitement. And people suddenly start joining the church. And you've got this guy, Bliss, who is an acolyte of Whitefield, who starts to, follow these same sort of precepts. And so here's an example, and you can look at your handout, about a description in the Boston Evening Post in 1743, about Bliss, and they're saying that he began to raise his voice, extravagant gestures. There was groaning among the auditors, which he raised his voice higher, and then the congregation was in the utmost confusion, and they were crying out in doleful accents, some howling, some laughing, some singing, and Mr. Bliss still roaring them to come to Christ. They answering, I will, I'm coming. So you can imagine that if you were an old school Puritan, this was shocking, okay? And indeed, there was a backlash, okay? And so while more and more people start joining the church, the old school of folks that said, hey, you have to be the elect, we're disciplined, and also that Bliss was not really sort of following his hymnal very closely when he was doing these sermons, they actually kind of more or less put him on trial. Okay, they brought in ministers from all around. They said, Guy, here are all of our accounts against you. In the end, the minister said, you're right, but slap him on the wrist and go on, just behave better. So they got mad. And so what did they do? That takes us to our second stop. They formed a breakaway church. And the breakaway church they called the West Congregation. But because it met in the newly built Black Horse Tavern, which probably was a nicer building in some respects than the church was, they were derisively called the Black Horse Church. And so 20 families break away. A lot of the most prominent people, if you look at these last names, Hosmer, Buttrick, Miles, Minnow, these are all like the leading men of the time. And while the Lees were not sort of instigators in this and sort of head of this church, they were part of that. And so for the next 15 years or so, they operated independently. They tried to, and in fact succeeded, to get away from having to pay the tax for the minister. So they no longer had to pay for the minister. That was probably for someone like Lee a real big motivator. But they were not allowed to create their own parish. They're a real standalone parish. And they even had the former minister give some sermons and whoever else they could find. Anyway, the Black Horse Tavern still exists. It was originally on the site of the library, where the public library is today. And the Brooks, the guy who owned the house and the tavern, before Brooks, the tavern was there. When they built out Hubbard Street, he was one of the investors, and they moved the house there, and it stands there today. It's a beautiful house. It has a huge beech tree in front of it. So certainly worth a look. And it's also an important house from also the abolitionist days as well. So let's move on now. So we've gone through, we've got this breakaway congregation, and then what happens? Well, in 1764, Whitefield comes back to Concord and gives another big sermon. And Bliss gives another big sermon. So Bliss is in the morning, Whitefield's in the afternoon, and people say, man, that Bliss, he gave such a great sermon, it was even better than Whitefield's. But it was his last sermon. He falls sick and dies. Okay, so the West Church seizes their chance. It's like, we're finally done with Bliss. We can, reconcile, we can bring the church back together, get on a good footing. So they're all psyched to try to select a minister, but meanwhile, there was a conspiracy within the church to find a successor to Bliss's legacy. And so they went out and they decided that this guy, Billy Emerson, who is fresh out of school, would be their man. And among the people that was most upset about this was Joseph Lee. In fact, he even interviewed Emerson. And as you can see here, he was not very impressed. It talks about how, and this is from his diaries, he talks about how, he was sensible that he fooled away his time and was very much to blame and ought to go back to college and study divinity 2 years before he undertook to supply a pulpit in any place, that he had only preached but twice before coming to Concord, and he had only made 2 sermons in that time. So basically, Lee said, this guy's unqualified. He tries to lead a campaign to get at least Emerson's salary reduced. And, if not, just get the guy run out of town. He fails. Okay, so a couple years pass. And actually, Emerson proves to be very popular and maybe not as crazy as Bliss, though they do have, again, more of these sort of, they put him on trial effectively again a few times. And then a lot of the breakaway families decide, okay, maybe we want to rejoin the church. So then Lee decides, okay, why not? I'll put my name in. And what happens? Well, they don't let him join. Okay, so what happened was you had to come and you kind of make a confession of your sins when you joined the church. And then the congregants kind of decide whether you're worthy. And usually it was kind of a perfunctory thing. But with Lee, there was a lot of bad blood over time. And we'll see a little bit more about how bad it got. But that, especially with dealing with people's mortgages, widows and orphans, people on hard times, they felt like he was taking advantage. And so they said no. And they escalated. So the aggrieved brethren were these folks that were hanging out with, that were friends of Lee's, and they raised a ruckus, and then they held basically, what would you call it? Kind of a trial almost, to say, hey, why shouldn't this guy Lee be allowed to join?
I
Yeah.
don't think you explained he was like a mortgage broker.
Well, I did at the beginning. Yeah, so he was really basically the mortgage banker. Yeah, for the town, more or less, before banks. And so after all of that, there is an official finding that they couldn't prove the injustices that he had been accused of, and yet he still wasn't allowed to join the church. So this is just terrible injustice from his point of view. So he maybe got even a little bit. So what happens next? So all of a sudden, posted in a tavern was, and actually I went to the Massachusetts Genealogical Historic Society because in Bob Gross's book, he references this as the location for this document. I was hoping to find this juicy document, and I could not. All I could find was some reference to it existing. But what was posted was a set of allegations that Billy Emerson had gone to Maine with Phoebe Bliss, the daughter of the former minister, before they got married. Okay? Total scandal, total scandal. And actually, they did eventually get married, right, these two. And also, I think Bob Gross's recent, well, I guess it wasn't so recent, your research has shown that firstborn children were born out of wedlock 30% of the time in this time. Conceived out of wedlock, conceived out of wedlock. So it's a totally credible idea that these guys were fooling around before, they got married. And this is like the daughter of the minister and the new minister. So it's a total scandal, total scandal. So that starts, and people assumed it was Lee who put this thing together. Second thing that happened was Lee decides, okay, I'm not getting my standing in the church. I'm, not on the select board or board of selectmen, none of these things. I got to get mine. I'm going to run for the state rep for Concord. And so he runs against, unfortunately, probably the most popular guy in town, Captain James Barrett. But it's so controversial that they hold a secret ballot. And if you've ever been to our town meetings and stuff, it's all public vote. The idea that you do a secret ballot, you only do that like once in a lifetime. So he lost 2-1, but it just created further bad blood. So he did have some buddies, but the minority. Yeah.
There's no public record of Lee running against Barrett.
Really?
The only way I learned about this is in the papers of Lemuel Shattuck at the New England Just-Gen. You got notes that Shattuck took of his interviews with people who remembered the late colonial period.
Oh, really?
And so it's in his little note that he was told about this campaign by Lee against Barrett.
Okay, because it is a public record that Barrett was elected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they didn't record any kind
Oh,
of.
the contest. Okay.
Because they put such a premium, the town clerks in the community did, on unanimity.
Right.
That they really, you had to have the town just about pulling itself apart before you could actually get a roll call vote in a tally.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. So anyway, after this failed attempt at election, actually there's a period of time from 1772 to 1774 where Lee gets sort of rehabilitated. And I think it's really because he was convenient to the town at that time. So what's happening in the broader context? The British are just, putting on the pressure incrementally from the Stamp Act and moving on from there. So what the town really wants to do is to show a united front. And when the Boston Committee of Correspondence is formed in response to the British saying, hey, they're going to put the judges on their payroll, and as a result, they're going to be, answerable to them. The Concord forms a committee to respond to Boston's letter. And so they pick not only their, most ardent Whigs, but they pick folks like Daniel Bliss Esquire, the son of Daniel Bliss, who was a Tory, a known Tory. And they pick Dr. Joseph Lee. And so they come up with a letter, a statement that kind of represents the broader Concord. Bliss is unable to sign on to it. He's a little nervous, but everybody else does, including Lee. And so here on the right, you see the document, which I got from the Genealogical Society, a facsimile of. And so the town meeting unanimously approves the letter. So he's sort of starting to get back in. And then by July of 1774, the church has finally said, you know what, we'll just let these guys back in. They just have to make sort of a general confession like anybody, but yeah, we'll say yes. So everything's looking hunky-dory, like Lee might get back into society. But then the worst happens. So, so first thing that happens is August 30th to 31st, Concord's holding a convention among all of the towns in the Middlesex County. And they were sort of the Shire town, if you will, for Middlesex County. So, and they create resolutions in response to what the British called the coercive acts and what the colonials called the intolerable acts, right? And so this is where the Boston folks had to quarter soldiers in their house, where there was effectively a blockade of Boston, and also where not only were the judges on the payroll of Britain, but they were picked by Britain. Okay, no more elections, no more local governance. So especially that last point really stuck in the craw of Concord. And so they said, we aren't gonna listen to these judges. We don't think that they have standing, okay? And then the next day in the morning, just almost by chance, the British go to Somerville and they take gunpowder that had been stockpiled by the locals. And there were rumors going around that there was bloodshed and that who knows what was going on. So then the Concordians are like ready to march to Concord. Lee, to Cambridge, because that's where these judges were and all this stuff they were living. And so Lee gets wind of this and he's like, you know, this is gonna go blow up, okay? So first of all, there's stories about how Ephraim Wood, who actually Bob Gross showed me, had just the month before said, oh, Dr. Joseph Lee is a good guy. He says to him, hey, you want to come with us on our march tomorrow? And you know, Lee says, oh, I can't make it. I can't make it. But meanwhile, after dark, he jumps on his horse and he heads to Cambridge, okay? And he warns the judge, who happens to also be called Joseph Lee, but no relation, you know, that, hey, this is going down. These people are coming for you, okay? So problem is, at dawn, he's coming back. Lee's house is off of Elm Street, but there's no Elm Street. There's no bridge over the river at Elm Street. So what he would do is he would ford the river, you know, in low water on his horse. And, well, somebody saw him, and they saw his stockings down around, let's see, here we go. He was seen fording the river in great haste with his long stockings down to his heels, okay? And so Ephraim Wood says this. That's his story. Well, it's actually Ephraim Wood's grandson says this in a memoir about him in the Memoirs of the Social Circle. So he's been outed. Okay, so now what happens? Well, September 13th, it's the next time that the Court of Common Pleas is supposed to meet in Concord. And instead, a mob comes and prevents the court from holding session throughout the day. And then 6 days later, the mob holds its own court. And what they do is they bring to justice Joseph Lee and others, but especially Joseph Lee. And they say, Guy, you better sign this confession, okay? And so there is a very famous confession. It's quoted by virtually everybody. And it says, I mean, you know, every Concord history, you just can't help but quote this thing. So it's, you know, where I, Joseph Lee of Concord, on the evening of 1st Ultimo, did rashly and without consideration make a private and precipitate journey from Concord to Cambridge to inform Judge Lee that the county was assembling to come down and on no other business. That he and others concerned might prepare themselves for the event, and with the avowed intention to deceive the people, by which the parties assembling might have been exposed to the brutal rage of the soldiery, by all of which I have justly drawn upon me the displeasure of my countrymen. When I coolly reflect upon my own imprudence, it fills my mind with the deepest anxiety. I deprecate the resentment of my injured country, humbly confess my errors, and implore the forgiveness of a generous and free people, solemnly declaring that for the future I will never convey any intelligence to any of the court party, neither directly nor indirectly, by which the designs of the people may be frustrated in opposing the barbarous policy of an arbitrary, wicked, and corrupt administration. Joseph Lee. So he might not have been that happy writing that, but they were satisfied. The good news was that was his punishment. He was done, okay? And it did capture the imagination of writers. So here, I've just taken a little excerpt from a novel, Little Maid of Concord by Margaret Sidney. And there's actually a long thread, probably 70 pages in this novel, about Lee, that Tory Lee, and Tory Lee's sojourn into Cambridge. And so she has this little character sketch about him, you know, and there's very little, right, to really put flesh on the bones of who this guy was. And of course, this is all made up, but, you know, the idea that his possessions, you know, that he went to his window, drew aside the curtain, looked into the night, and before him spread his ample meadows, swelling away from the gentle river flowing and caressing curve around them. And that's actually true. He's on the curve of the river. As far as his eye could reach, he could say with pride, mine. Okay, and so I think that's nice. So now we come to April 19th, 1775. And the interesting thing about this date is actually virtually nothing happens to Joseph Lee. So it's actually an anticlimax. You know, the biggest day in Concord is actually for Joseph Lee. Apparently, the British came, they visited him, they paid him kind of a cordial visit, and off they went, and nothing really came of it. But there were consequences, because now you've got outright conflict. And so anybody with Tory tendencies is sort of assumed to be a spy. And Daniel Bliss, Esquire, heads out of town a few days before. He actually got heads up that, okay, something's going down, I'm out of here. And he moves to Canada, he ends up doing real well in Canada, he never looks back. His property's confiscated in town. But Lee, you know, this is what I call loyal adversary. Lee sticks around, okay? And he's loyal, you know, he's a loyalist, but he's also loyal to Concord. And more than that, he's probably loyal to his possessions. He's accumulated a lot, and it's all right there, and he can't take it with him, okay? So he's sitting out there, and the Committee of Correspondence for Concord says, we got to do something about this guy. So what they do is they put him under house arrest. So just, you know, a week after the incident at Old North Bridge, they confine him to the farm his family now lives on, and if he should presume to go beyond the bounds and should be killed, his blood be upon his own head. Okay, so, and look at Ephraim Wood Jr. is among the signatories, okay? So, you know, and James Barrett, okay? You see that, you know, well, James Barrett Jr., it's the son of the captain, but even so. So he's in trouble, and he's stuck on his 375-acre farm, but, you know, he's still stuck on his farm. So luckily, there's a little bit of comic relief very soon, because that's the year that Harvard comes to Concord. because, of course, the Continental Army is gone to Harvard. And so now Lee puts up 12 students, including his own son, at his farm. So he's got 12 fresh, young Harvard students there, and they spend the year living there and, of course, going to classes downtown. So that's not too bad. And by the way, see this illustration? So I have been on a hunt, and I'm no historian, but what I've learned a little bit about the frustrations of history with this project, that I read from Joseph Lee's great-grandson, William Lee, that there were supposedly good photos to be had of the Lee estate, which burned down in 1857. So I'm like, I asked Anke Voss, like, where's the photo? And she's like, 1857? I don't think there's a photo. So then I'm reading, so it turns out that this William Lee did this huge history of all the Lee family, and I suspect it's because of the Grindal Reynolds. When he did his lecture, he, at the end, not only said that, well, Lee is selfish and all, he said it's a family type. And then he went on and described the other descendants of Lee and claimed that they were, rebels in the Civil War and all this other stuff. And so I think William Lee wrote his entire genealogy as a response. And he actually did literally, in a genealogical register, write a riposte to the Grindal Reynolds lecture. And there, among many things, he says, there are good photos to be had of a sketch of the farm. And now I'm like, okay. So I went to and by Frank Ballou. Well, it turns out Frank Ballou is like, he's a caricature artist. He does comic sketches and stuff. And so I looked at his books and stuff and couldn't find anything. Meanwhile, like, I look on this familysearch.org, some one of these genealogical websites. Somebody had uploaded on the Joseph Lee page, not Dr. Joseph Lee, but his grandfather, this image. No attribution, no reference to who uploaded it. But you look at this and, all right, this bridge is probably the Main Street Bridge, right? Because there was no Elm Street Bridge. But looking out in the distance, and I actually shared this image with Denny McIntyre, who lives on the site where the Lee farm is. And so she's not sure, but it's a possibility that this is a image of the farm.
Excuse me, Matt.
Yeah.
Ask a scandalous question.
Yeah.
As long as we're looking at the river, was there something about when he was crossing the river and his stockings were at his feet that's a sign of some
moral failing? Yeah,
We're
I would say
supposed
so.
to get wet, or what was it? What do low stockings?
I think it was just he had been in such haste. He'd been riding all night long, and they just sort of worked their way down, and he didn't have time to pull things back up. He was hoping to get home before dawn.
That was on his way back.
On his way back, crossing, fording the river back. He was almost home. He was almost home. That's what I believe the story was meant to say. And whether it's true or not, who knows? I mean, it was, there's a lot of legend around this.
He was a gentleman who could not keep up appearances.
Yes. Was he a gentleman, though? So anyway, but it wasn't all fun and games while he was there. So one of the problems was, actually, people really wanted to kill the guy. They did not, want, and so there's a incident in January of 1776 where they actually, returning soldiers shoot at the building, and it's witnessed by his household. So now I also wanted to take a moment and to state that Lee, of course, is not alone. I mean, he married, Daniel Bliss, the Reverend, actually married him and his wife in 1836. So they weren't so completely loose ends, though you couldn't, how else would you get married? But he actually had enslaved people on his estate. So There were two. One was Peggy, who he had to sell to pay debts after he was confined to his estate. And the other was Cato Lee. And so Cato was an interesting character because, for a couple reasons. The main one is that in January of 1776, the Continental Congress authorizes black soldiers to be in the army. Now, there were black soldiers at the moment of the revolution, but they were kind of militia. But now in the Continental Army, initially, Washington said, no, we don't want these guys. But then he was like, maybe we kind of need these guys. And so, yeah, he asks in December, and then in January they say, yeah, okay, they can come on down. And so almost right away, in February, Cato Lee takes off. And he serves, and I got the entry from the Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors of the Revolutionary War, 7-volume set. He served apparently into 1777. And then I think part of the deal was you serve, and after you're done, you're a free man, okay? So this was a big deal. He had been in the Lee household and his brother's household since, he was a kid. So, and, or since he was 15, yeah. And so now he's in his 30s and he's free. The problem is, and I think if you've read Black Walden or any of the other stories, is he doesn't really have any place to go. He doesn't have any assets. He doesn't, it's a agrarian society where you have to have capital to get land. And so he just comes back. And he serves there in the household. He's provided for in the will, but he is effectively not emancipated, through the rest of his life. So and I should also say that in this tale that Reverend Bliss, Reverend Emerson, they also had enslaved people in their household. So this is like, it was just a mark of, I've got money, I've got possessions, among them are people. And that they didn't have any issues with that. And it really was only the Revolutionary War that started the transition away from it. So now I'm going to bring us to the end of our tour. So eventually in June of 1776, the Committee of Correspondence says, okay, Lee, you're free, you're done, you serve your time. And he, over time, gets invited into the church. After Emerson dies in the war, they get a new minister, Ezra Ripley. Ezra brings the town together. He gets invited, and he actually joins the church. He actually helps found one of the first libraries in town. He actually becomes a kind of a legitimate dude, and he lives to the ripe old age of 81. And then by the time he's buried, I went to the South Burying Ground, and his headstone struck me as being large. And I looked up on the database and ran some calculations, and it indeed is the largest headstone in the South Burying Ground. It's not the largest one in Concord from the era, but it's the largest in that burying ground. And so he actually, had some status. And now, of course, sure, he had a nice, amount of money that could be used to buy that in his estate. But the other thing was, he ended up with a nice inscription. So, in memory of Dr. Joseph Lee, who died in hope of a glorious resurrection, April 10th, 1797, Ateus 81, so having attained the age of 81. The longest life is short. Happy the man who lives it to his God. No other life is worthy of our choice. What though we wade in wealth or soar in fame, earth's highest honor ends in here he lies, and dust to dust concludes the noblest song. So that's the life of Dr. Joseph Lee and a few local scenes. And I just want to thank Bob Gross for sending me on this thing, and for Victor for inspiring my love of history. And do I get my tour guide license?
I don't give the select board gives it.
Oh, it's true. Well, I invited a couple of members.
Just tell them you have completed the course.
Okay, well, we don't have a quorum of the select board here, but hopefully they will be okay.
Taking questions?
I will tell them you have completed the course.
Okay, yes. So thanks for indulging me in that. It was probably much longer than you ever
No, it was
expected.
a glorious resurrection.
Yes, yeah, I'll take a question, sure.
You seem to skim over this one thing I read in here, so I wanted to ask you about it. It seems like they really beat him horribly.
Where?
Wait, that's what I wondered, am I reading this wrong? He was compelled to endure such punishment as an excited multitude might inflict, which they called humbling the Tories.
Yeah, humbling,
Several
but
suffered in this manner. He was most scrupulously examined and severely treated. That's what I wondered, was it a beating?
no, I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
No,
He
no.
wasn't tarred and feathered.
No. There were some incidents. If you read Bob Gross's books, there were certainly some mischief that was done against, like, Cumming, the guy who's got a building named after him, maybe not for too much longer, out here. Yeah, John Cumming, he was another slaveholder.
Would you repeat the question to the person?
Yeah, so the question was, when you look at the language about the mob when they were bringing him to mob justice, it sounds as if perhaps he might have had physical violence done against him. When you say, to endure such punishment as an excited multitude might inflict, which they called humbling the Tories. This is Lemuel Shattuck. No, humbling the Tories, they meant literally like humbling them from a verbal point of view. And certainly he was humbled by this statement that he had to read.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I have a question. I think especially for people who live in Concord, it's interesting to know what his property, how large his property
Oh, I
was.
described it at the beginning. It was just the entirety of Neshotah Hill and out Elm Street. Yeah.
375 acres?
Yeah, yeah. It was originally Simon Willard's farm. So Simon Willard, one of the founders of Concord, and the sort of lead selectman of that era, he had that farm originally. Yeah.